we had three experts, sort of spectacular. Immediately upon reading there a little bit about sort of what they studied, I became painfully nervous about the play. The plays are all about finding a great truth as opposed sometimes to factual truth. But we're going to have a little bit of a conversation about that. So let's begin, I think, with the question about the German-Jewish issue. Like the play really does talk at length. So I'm going to try and find a way not to stand in the sun. It talks at length about the issues of the Jews in Germany. What could you folks talk to us about both some of the issues that the actual characters were experiencing in the play, but even in the broader context, things that were happening to the Jews in Germany in World War
I? I think their play actually speaks to quite a number of things that are historically accurate, at least in my reading of it. One is that the patriotism of German Jews, how they saw this as their war, their ability to prove themselves. To me, one of the more sympathetic characters in the play is the father, rabbi, who's both ironic but also pacifist. And I would say that that is kind of an outlier for most of the intellectualism, the German Jewish intellectualism of the early 20th century. Most of the intellectuals who were Jews in Germany cheered on the war. Hermann Cohen, who was a great Kantian philosopher, thought it was a great war. He went to the United States to try to raise funds for it and try to get the Americans to get in on the German side. Martin Buber cheered this war on as the greatest thing, and sort of a form of religious anarchy that was going to help German Jews realize themselves. Probably the one exceptional figure in this case was a very young German Jew who feigned madness in order to get out of the war and went to a Swiss sanatorium by the name of Gershom Scholem, who then became a scholar of Jewish mysticism. But I think the rabbi/father character is very exceptional in this play, because I think most people of his age, let's say 50s, 60s, would be supporting the war.
And I think that for me, one of the most powerful images, if I go back to Berlin, is to go to the Weissensee Jewish Cemetery and go to the section of the cemetery where the markers are all inscribed. He gave his life for the fatherland, and so that this now in the middle of Berlin to think about this simultaneity of their identity in this cemetery, a Jewish cemetery, but also that imagining it as a German identity as well. Again, just trying to think about how these lines get drawn, that in the run-up to the war, as much as there were huge demonstrations in support of the war, there were 100,000 socialists demonstrating against the war in Berlin. And so that this tension there are layers of this that complicate the standard story that we still maintain about the beginning of the war.
I had a couple different reactions to this issue. And the first is that I think the play brought out very well not even ambivalence, kind of the nationalism of German Jews. And the main organization of German Jews before the war was called the League, the Central Union of Germans of Jewish faith. And so again, foregrounding the German, making the Jewish faith just a modifier of the Germanness. And of course, it doesn't get better for Jews after 1918, as Father seemed to hope. And there's the issue of the notorious Jew count, or the Jew census that the German army conducted in 1916. It doesn't appear in the play, but I think it's, Kuttner would have been behind that.
It's in another draft, actually.
and I can say more about that if people are interested, but I don't want to.
Sure.
I think it's very great.
Okay, so in 1916, in the fall of 1916, the War Ministry, which is the parliamentary part of the German military, conducted a census of German Jews. And it was basically, there was a letter-writing campaign by anti-Semitic organizations suggesting that Jews weren't doing their part of the war, that they were getting positions behind the lines, that they were using loopholes to get out of military service. And again, there's a huge debate about this and the significance of it. My sense is that the War Ministry, which probably shared the military's kind of general anti-Semitic viewpoints, just wanted to get these people off their back and said, all right, fine, we'll do this count. And either it'll give us ammo and say, no, Jews are serving, please leave us alone. Or if it turns out that Jews are somehow underrepresented, we could probably use that too. So the strange part is that, to my knowledge, and somebody else may know differently, but it was never published. It was never released. And so what you get, it remains kind of a mystery what the results were. And you get people on both sides who claim to have seen the results immediately after the war, saying, no, Jews, in fact, were overrepresented and earned more medals and died at higher rates. And then anti-Semites would say, no, we saw this, and it was clear that they were getting out of duty. And so it becomes this kind of political football. But the results still, and no one has ever found them in the archive, as far as I know. We don't know where they are.
So the actual study is not found.
Yes, that's fascinating. The anti-Semitism in the play is, I think, a fascinating piece that would sort of blunt aggressiveness of Lockenour towards Gisela, who he's obviously in a relationship with. So it's interesting to sort of hear the larger context for that. How about, let's sort of shift gears just a little bit. We'll return to this, I have a feeling. What about, just one of the other issues the play really does bring up, especially as we watch the whole arc of it, is this idea of early military planning. And the idea that, you have this Schlieffen plan that appears at the beginning, and how did that planning impact the development of the war, and ultimately maybe even perhaps consider diplomatic relationships to that.
And so I'm a bit of an outlier on this, I think, certainly in terms of the popular perception that somehow military timetables were pushing Europe toward war faster and sort of uncontrollably. And there's a great article, which if you want to contact, I forgot to bring cards, but if you want to contact me, I'm happy to share it with you, that dismantles that argument pretty effectively, that was written probably about 20 years ago. And it's logical. You think the Schlieffen Plan did exist. There was this plan to invade France quickly, knock them out in 6 weeks, which, by the way, I always like to emphasize the fact, how long did France last in 1940?
Much less.
6 weeks. How long did it take Germany to conquer France in 1870? 6 weeks. Well, I mean, the war lasted a year, but the main battles were over in the first 6 weeks. So the notion of 6 weeks being some crazy scheme to conquer France isn't actually so crazy if you understand those other events. And in fact, when we look at the documentary record for July 1914, you don't actually see generals pounding on the table saying, we've got to move now, we've got to move now. They're aware of the constraints, and there are times when Moltke says, hey, if we're going to do this, we should do it now. But in fact, the civilian leadership maintains control. The Kaiser at certain points says, no, stop, even though the Russians are started, we're not going to start. So I like to remind people that it was a rational, what seemed to them a rational, conscious decision to go into war. It wasn't some sort of ticking time bomb that was created by the plan.
And I mean, on the flip side of that, I mean, in terms of the decision to end the war, this is the fact that is the German General Staff that is the impetus for negotiations in the summer and the fall of 1918. And the question about whether or not there should be this last-ditch mass mobilization of the German population is not the General Staff, but other, including Walter Lockenour, the German Jewish head of AEG, the German General Electric, who was instrumental in kind of rationalizing the German war economy. In terms of, so thinking about what war looked like, both in its beginning and its end, has some strange bedfellows in it.
So we heard this name as General von Moltke in the play, right? And we also, we know there's another guy named Ludendorff, who's sort of at the end of that period. Can you talk anywhere about, so we have Lockenour sort of sits in there for us as a dramatic figure, creation to sort of guide us through the story. Can you talk about the difference in sort of the military approach from some of those individual general army folks?
You're the Ludendorff.
Yeah, right. So I saw a lot of Ludendorff in the Lockenour character, and in terms of, he becomes the chief of general staff. So Moltke is in place in 1914. He only makes it through October. A guy named Falkenhayn comes in and runs the show through 1915 into 1916. And then finally Ludendorff, who's been a fantastic war hero and won all these great victories against at Liège in August of 1914, against the Russians at Tannenberg in September, and then is enjoying tremendous success on the Eastern Front. He's brought in to kind of save the day in 1916. And I'm going to say that a lot of people criticize Moltke, that maybe he was a little too tenuous in his leadership at the beginning. Certainly after the war, people were saying, man, if Ludendorff had been there in 1914, we would have won it all, because he built this legend as a military genius. But in terms of their style of leadership, I'd say it's as much a function of their learning process during the war. That what Ludendorff innovates in military terms with elastic defense, being able to defend with fewer casualties against artillery and all the things that the British and the French are throwing at him, stormtroop tactics, new ways of attacking fortifications that the German army comes up with in the course of 1917. Those are part of the learning process that Moltke didn't have the benefit of. So I'd hate to say that he couldn't have learned those things, that he was somehow innately incapable of doing that. But for politically as much as militarily, he had to go much earlier because the Schlieffen plan didn't work the way it was supposed to.
Okay, that sounds good. So let's talk a little bit about the impact of World War I. I'm personally really fascinated by this. That's why we're sort of covering this as a theater company for years to come. And that's one of the things that attracted me to this place. There's a lot of echoes for the future. Why don't we start with looking at the situation again of our lead characters. How did World War I impact or influence sort of the Jewish experience through the rest of the century? That's a giant question. I know it's hard. But especially perhaps the development of Israel. I think we can see where it goes in Germany, perhaps into World War II, but how about some things that we may not be less aware of?
I actually think if we take a very local answer to that, you can have a very different perspective. I think that German Jewry between 1918 and 1933 is a very different story than you might think if you look at the story from 33 to 45. I mean, there's an explosion of creativity in the Weimar period, in arts, in letters, in political thought, and that Jews are at the center of. And it's not only Rathenau, who is a major figure in the early Weimar Republic, but it's Buber and Rosenzweig and their house in Frankfurt. And the 15-year period between 1918 and 1933 is possibly the most creative period for German Jewry, maybe even over the course of the last few centuries. And you have all the young intellectuals who are gaining their formative education in the 1920s, 1930s, German universities, who then go on to their exilic lives elsewhere. But it's not a direct train, and I use that metaphor intentionally, between 1918 and the German Jewish experience of the Second World War at all, I would say. I don't know how you guys do it.
I would agree completely. I mean, I think that there is not a direct link, and that the particular choices that people make, and the particular choices that politicians make at various points, whether you're talking about 1918 or 1919, in the aftermath of the revolution, whether you're talking about 1929 and 1930 after the economic crisis and how that starts, there is not inevitability. And I would say that in terms of trying to think about how this emerges, we need to take seriously the fact that people made, and Germans made their world, and the states around them made their world, and they weren't just the objects of some faceless force of history that was sweeping across and inevitably towards genocide at the center of the 20th century.
And they're not Zionists.
Okay, great.
And they're not
so could we say that
They're not Zionists.
Right.
I mean, look, there are individual Zionists. Let's not be insane about that. There certainly are individual Zionists amongst German Jewry, but by and large, they are not Zionists. It's a minority opinion. They don't think it's a good idea.
The German Jewish professor of Romance languages, Victor Klemperer, who we know because of his diaries that come out in the 1980s, when he is looking at the rise of the Nazis, he sees it not as primarily a German phenomenon. He denounces them as being too American, and so that this is this constant thing that he has to wrestle with, right? So they wrestle with it. Yeah.
Great, wow, that was fantastic, lovely. So we would not then say that World War I is significantly impacting the development of Israel from your perspective, or does it have an influence?
I mean, I think of course it has to in terms of geopolitics and rearranging the map of the Middle East. But I mean, again, like my colleague just said, I think there are really deliberate, conscious choices that have to do with neo-imperialist politics in the 20s, 30s, and 40s that lead to the creation of a particular state at a particular juncture. I don't think it's inevitable at all.
And of course, maybe it is connected in the sense that I totally agree with that. Contingency matters, and agency, people's decisions matter. But I mean, you do see the growth of the stab in the back legend, the notion that the German army hadn't been defeated on the battlefield, which, if you kind of look at it sideways, German soldiers, when the armistice happened in November 1918, German soldiers were everywhere on foreign soil. They had conquered Russia, they were occupying Poland, parts of the Balkans, and they were standing in France and Belgium. So they could, though they were deserting in giant numbers and they were out of supplies and they were going to lose, they could kind of look at the map and say, hey, we didn't get beaten. And Ludendorff was the principal author of this notion of being stabbed in the back, that Jews and socialists had undermined morale at home and created this revolution when Germany was on the verge of victory. Total lie, but he was able to sell it, and Hitler then famously carries on that mission and sells that myth quite effectively. And you do get this rise of anti-Semitism after the war that's noticeable. You get immigration from the Eastern territories. Large numbers of Jews that immigrate to Germany during the Weimar Republic because it is a safe haven, relatively speaking, in this cultural center. So, against which then the Nazis react very strongly. Nazis and many Germans react against this immigration as unwelcome. So it does feed this process that Hitler is able to capitalize on, but I wouldn't say that it's inevitable.
And there are moments of violence already in the violence against Jews in the Schönfeld in the early 1920s. I mean, so that those kind of rehearsals as well.
The only other thing I was going to add in terms of immigration is that of Eastern Jews into Germany in this interwar period is that there's an enormous amount of internecine Jewish hatred. So Franz Rosenzweig has this famous quip where he says, there's no such thing as a Jewish question, there's only an Eastern Jewish question. And I mean, the quotations have a lot easier, rolls off the tongue a lot easier in German, and it's a joke, but I mean, that's very real. And I think the other piece is that there is this double helix of the Jew as capitalist and the Jew as communist that is very, very powerful in this interwar period.
Great, fascinating. I'm going to open up and see if anyone from the House wants to answer any questions. I have a couple more, but I certainly don't want to exclude you folks. So anything you'd like to ask? One second.
I'll jump in. One of the things I think is so powerful about the play is you see somebody who's such a true leader in the cause at the beginning and goes to this incredible period of total disillusion by the end. It's really weak, and I think that is really powerful as a piece of theater. And I'm curious, does history bear that out as something that people, soldiers, go through, not necessarily just in World War, but in your, research and observations?
Well, I think there are two of what may be the most well-known war memoirs or novels from the German side of the First World War are, what's probably more familiar in the West is, in the United States, is Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. There's also another one in The Storm of Steel by a man named Ernst Jünger, who was one of the most highly decorated infantry soldiers of the First World War, and so always, looking at the idea of the scars and all the bullets passing through him, that was the image of Jünger, who was wounded 7 times, that had 14 holes in him, and that this event, that was sort of how he represented the authenticity of his account of the war. But the dedications of these two books are very different. So Remarque, and if you see the film version from the Louis Milestone film version, he dedicated to this is a film or a book that's dedicated to those who, even though they may have survived the shells, were nonetheless destroyed by the war. Whereas Jünger is dedicated to the fallen, right? In terms of locating the kind of meaning that comes out of the war. And so I think that this is one of the really important pieces, is to think, what stories are told retroactively? And there wasn't a single story that was told about the war, even among German soldiers. And I think that really mattered, and the ways in which those stories came into play, and the idea that only an authentic war story authorized people to talk about the war and then to leverage that in the post-war politics. And I think that that's an issue that matters very much in the 21st century in terms of thinking about who is authorized to speak about war. Is it only those who bear the scars of combat, or that somehow are the only people that have the insights? Well, I mean, in the play, I think that's one of the interesting things, that the soldier realizes, well, that his father, who was not the soldier, was not the warrior, nonetheless had some great insights about what war could mean at that point in time. And so I think those challenges to how we tell war stories is still a really important way to push back.
And we've seen that story, I think, in literature and the arts, probably most prominently, even in the United States with the expatriate community and the Hemingway and Los Pasos and people like that, who very quickly, after a relatively brief time in the war, become disillusioned with it. And I don't know if you know the playwright Ernst Toller, who's a great example of this this evolution. I don't know, he was Jewish. I don't know about his patriotism early in the war, but certainly by the end of the war, he was very disillusioned, writes these horrifying expressionist plays, about many of them about the war directly. But there's the flip side of that is the glorification of the war that happens with the Nazis and broad swaths of the public in Britain and in France and in the United States as well as in Germany who either, many of them maybe a little too young to experience the war personally, who joined the Freikorps, these paramilitary bands after the war,
When would you say that the sort of breakdown starts happening with soldiers in the war? Maybe on both sides, from the sort of real fanaticism at the beginning to some level of desertion at the end.
Well, there are breakdowns even very early in different ways. I mean, even if you think about the iconic Christmas truce of 1914, which is in some ways a pushback against the war, offering a counter-argument against the relentless narrative of the war as the only way that's making sense of what's going on. Of course, that doesn't repeat it.
What the Christmas truce is.
So in 1914, there was spontaneous fraternization between German and British soldiers on Christmas Eve, and they sang hymns together and exchanged gifts and played soccer. Yeah, and that does seem now to, people seem to be coming down on the side that there was a soccer game. But that does not recur. It doesn't happen again in December 15. And so part of this is I think in this question of war stories that people are telling themselves that there's also a pushing back to that there's a internalization of the rhetoric of war that is also part of the soldier's way of experiencing that. The French mutinies in 1917 and obviously the Russians are deserting in huge numbers. So but I think there are different moments along the way that these experiences are up for counter-interpretation.
And the English poets, pretty early on, Wilfred Owen, Sassoon, Edward Thomas are writing some pretty devastating poetry about the war at 14, 15. And it's getting published and read. I think, like my colleague said earlier, there's not one story about the war. I think one of the reasons that World War I is so complicated is that there's just so many different angles to get at it.
Yeah, the poets are in fact one of the subjects of something we're doing next year. It's like a lot about Europe. It's about Owen and Sassoon that we'll be producing next year. It's a super cool play. So we go to the literary angle, so that's exciting. There's also a marvelous play about the Christmas truce that's being produced by a playwright who was in Philly last year. It's a big giant event kind of thing this year. So it's cool. It's just so intense and interesting. Can I get one more question from the crowd? I see someone had a question. There you go.
No, I was just surprised to learn, I grew up in England and Jewish, that had a great uncle who died in the Great War, and I just wondered how entrenched in the other country, in England and in France, was the Jewish loyalty and how, what Jewish opinion was in terms of going to war and how it differed from Germany.
It's a really terrific question, and I think the answer is different in both countries. I think that for French Jewry, a lot of this is happening in the shadow of the Dreyfus affair, and there is enormous anxiety to prove their patriotism. England less so, but and also the British Jewry, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th century, is largely a population of immigrants. The Jewish population in England explodes in the last quarter of the 19th century, similar to the Jewish population in the United States. And I don't know about homogenous attitudes toward the First World War in England, but in France, there's enormous anxiety about the Dreyfus affair. There's a wonderful book called The Jews in the Military, a history by Derek Penslar, who he's written a whole chapter on World War I, the first global Jewish war, where Jews are fighting against Jews all over the place. They're writing poems about the Maccabees. So there is enormous patriotism, but there's also enormous resistance.
Great. And one more question, maybe? We're doing really well, so.
I just really quickly, I think it would be, I'd be curious to hear you guys' take on, one of the things I was kind of exploring, just the concept of a preventable war, and I'm curious from your perspective to what degree it was preventable. I know it's kind of a gigantic question, you can look at it in different ways, but, you talk a little bit about the run, maybe not as clear cut thing, but I'm curious in terms of diplomacy and different ways that things could have gone to whatever field could have.
This kind of comes down to how you teach it, right? Because if you try to, you could write books about it and try to explain it, but how do you, think about how you teach it in the classroom?
I'd say that there's certainly plenty of people who wanted the war, but none of them wanted the war that they got.
They didn't know what they were getting.
And so I think that is, but that there were certainly the idea that there were people who were imagining what this war was going to look like. There were plenty of those too. So it's not as if there was, and again, this becomes one of the ways if you look at art and visual art, painting, that there are lots of ways of kind of imagining kind of cataclysmic outcomes of or possibilities in the beginning of the 20th century, even before you get to the war, that at least suggests the possibilities of alternative narratives. And even the fact, the fact that there were, even in Berlin, big anti-war protests in the run-up to 100,000 people on the street is a pretty significant number of people. I think that there is another narrative that was available, and that it didn't hold is, I guess, part of the ways in which people make their choices. But I would not say that any outcome was inevitable.
One of the problems we have is, and Paul alluded to this, is we confuse cause and consequence, right? When we think about what started the war. And we look at so there's a famous historian, Fritz Fischer, who wrote a book that famously charged the Germans. It was a premeditated decision by the Germans to start a war to gain territory. And what he did was he took this so-called September program, this group collection of war aims that the Germans issued in September, and kind of read it back into the summer, the July crisis and so forth, that this is what the Germans were looking for when they decided to start the war. But there's no relationship between the two, actually. The Germans are looking for something to justify the enormous sacrifices that have already happened by September, October of 1914. And so they need something. They need to say the war was for something. And we have to be careful how we read that to say, well, it's the Germans who decided for this. It was their fault, their responsibility.
The only thing I would say is this line that's attributed to Trotsky, which is that you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And I think there is a sense in terms of the First World War that, a lot of people want the war, but this isn't the war that they got. And, I think, it's a failure of diplomacy, but it's also the fact that there is contingency and there is agency, but, there are structural forces at play that are beyond the ability of any one individual to overcome that.
Let's wrap up with just one more question, and that is sort of the impact of World War I for the 20th century. So we talked a little bit about the impact. And I'm actually going to set a timer. So you need, let's say 30 seconds to tell us about what you think is the most significant impact World War I had on the present or the rest of the century.
Man, I like that.
You warned us that this was coming, right?
That's right, I did actually.
Well, I would say that I think that the ways in which it ushers in a normalizing of a vision of revolutionary violence from multiple political directions, both during the war and then the immediate aftermath. I think that becomes a key legacy that matters a lot.
I would agree. That's a fancy way of saying, it spawns Nazism, it spawns Bolshevism, and those two things together add up to the rest of the 20th century in a certain telling of it. So.
I would just say to echo something that both of you said, a radical decentering of the notion of progress and a crisis of the liberal order. Maybe even a shattering of the liberal order that, the pieces of which politicians are still trying to pick up.
Ripples with imperialism, the
Yeah,
downfall of the empire.
Exactly.
And all that.
Great, that's good work. All right.